Stop Dry. William Ospina. Colombian writer, novelist, and critic born in Hervio, a municipality in the department of Tolima. Stop Dry. At some point, nature was something sacred to humanity, and for this reason it was admired, feared, and respected. But that communion was broken. Man became arrogant, considered himself the center of the universe and judged that nature was his, that it was there for his domination and exploitation. In this essay, William Ospina reflects on this process and traces its traces in religions, art, philosophy, science, history, literature, and reaches the dramatic conclusion that a stop along the way is urgent, since what is at stake is the survival of the planet and the human race. Nowhere is the verve of a colt known so much as the ability to stop in its tracks. Montaigne, Essays. Chapter 1. The Great Malaise. When in March 2016 the newspapers showed that the coral reef in Australia had been bleached, many in the world had the feeling that the definitive hour is coming. For a long time it was believed that the end of the world would be a single catastrophic event, a sort of cosmic spectacle like those evoked by Raphael Argolol in his admirable book The End of the World as a Work of Art. What we are beginning to see could rather be designated as the Great Malaise. It will not be without catastrophes, volcanic eruptions from Iceland to Indonesia, the plastic continent of the Pacific, the disappearance of the Arctic ice, the alarming danger of the melting of the Siberian permafrost that fragilely guards the largest deposits of methane in the world, death of species such as what has recently been called the apocalypse of the bees, but the current global warming, whose diagrams alarm us day by day, may not consist of a mere increase in temperatures, but in a progressive worsening of the conditions of life in the world. We feel it in the climate, with increasingly altered summers and winters, with the displacement of plant maps, with the modification of the niches of plant and insect species, with the loss of flocks and schools, with the mutation of viruses and the growing threat of pandemics. A planet that for millennia has been the most propitious setting for life, for our way of life, could be transfigured before our eyes into an inhospitable abode, with a scorching sun, toxic air, undrinkable water, irritated skin, respiratory complications, where the tissues go crazy, the senses are altered and the germs escape all control. Reached, as we have achieved so far, the era of greater safety in air transport, with almost perfect machines that reach their destination with astonishing precision, we run the risk that the air, still calm except for slight areas of turbulence, full of unforeseen dangers. We do not want sudden ice shelves, untimely hail, turbulence that could turn the atmosphere into ripples more unruly than the waves of Australia. Doctors are already warning that the gift of antibiotics, which half a century ago convinced us that we had triumphed over infections, could not only be reversed, but give rise to a generation of reinforced bacteria and viruses. Life has the duty to fight and defend itself in all organisms and in all species. If germs are a danger to us, we must not forget that we are a danger to germs, and that they may know better to protect themselves. The era of stupid and unscrupulous domination of humans over nature could lead to a sudden mutation that makes us the most fragile of species. And this will have happened, amazingly, thanks to our talent, our knowledge, and our insurmountable pride. It is likely that we only began to notice them when a good part of the alterations were already underway. It is not easy to say when the human being began to be aware of his own curses. When Isaac Asimov and Frederik Pohl wrote their book The Wrath of the Earth in Alarm, everything was already in serious turmoil. When in 1959 Aldous Huxley launched his tremendous warnings at the conferences in Santa Barbara, California, which he called The Human Situation, many evils had already been declared. When Humboldt, in the mid-19th century, described the Earth as a living organism, in which everything depends on everything, in which there is no movement that does not have its replica or phenomenon that does not encourage its opposite, we were already warned that any alteration of balance will necessarily produce consequences. The planet knows how to balance its forces, but we would be crazy if we thought that it would do so for the benefit of any particular species, and less so for the one that is altering everything in a destructive way. The unique condition of life is the original balance. Any arbitrary and above all excessive alteration will awaken forces that cannot be conducive to us. The world will be balanced by sacrificing us. If the earth becomes a red niche of toxic forests, or the desert that Nietzsche announced, the earth will accept it as its new reality, exactly as the coral reef barrier in Australia is becoming a wall before our cameras. White of dead corals where the algae will no longer find sustenance or exhale oxygen into the atmosphere. Global warming is nothing more than a planetary fever, but every fever is the symptom of a disease that can undermine not only the health of some species, but all of life. As Humboldt felt, there is a continuum of planetary life. It is offered before our eyes under the guise of individual beings, of perfectly differentiated species, but without a doubt some species are complementary to others. Every forest is a dialogue of forces, forms, substances, rhythms and metabolisms, and that is why when we are told that an ecosystem is only complete if there are felines in it, they are telling us that a tiger, a jaguar, or a panther are not particular creatures but the manifestation of the health of a living system. They are significant parts of a whole, and perhaps the death of jaguars can begin with the paleness of certain flowers, the weakening of certain stones, the rarefaction of certain algae or the silence of certain bird songs. A broad and human look, by opposing the schemes of profitability and performance, seems to bask in contemplation, and in the eyes of the managers of what is useful, it borders on the vertigo of mysticism and superstition. The great Leviathan only respects science when it serves as an instrument for his designs. When knowledge opposes power, it not only runs the risk of being denied, but will end up being slandered by industrial propaganda. Christ said in his time that it was necessary to give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. What is unique about this time is that now Caesar wants what is God's, and the time has come to shout that we cannot accept that deal. Chapter 2. The Creature Without Limits. The great powers of the time have been skillful in appropriating the planetary wealth, of the barras, the industry, the capitals, the banking deposits, the knowledge, the information, the spectacle. They have built a world in which they take care of our comfort through industry, our entertainment through a dazzling supply of entertainment, our education through the sophisticated business of pedagogy, our obedience through Pavlovian mechanisms of advertising, and our will thanks to the ineluctable effectiveness of the media. But what is his strength if not our weakness? What is his power if not our docility? What is his triumph if not our failure? For centuries humanity has deluded itself into naive political struggles for power, when the only reasonable thing would be not a struggle for power, but a struggle to deny power or to transform power into something else. If these great powers are, it is because they have someone to provide, someone to impose rules on, someone to give orders to, someone to flatter and flatter. Their imposingness is nothing more than the other name of our renunciation, and perhaps it is a mistake to fight against them. At this point in history it is becoming more and more evident that what has to be done against them must be done to us. Ingenious mankind over the millennia produced all sorts of magnificent inventions to make life more pleasant, more comfortable, more refined, and more beautiful. Nobody can have any objection against the human art that produced the umbrella and the folding chair, the toothbrush and the flower-scented soap, against the wise gastronomy that knew how to combine utility and delight, against the knowledge that together with ingenuity and good taste gave us pillows and towels, toilets and showers, the diversity of our homes and the kaleidoscopes of our clothing, pulleys and wheels, the possibility of warmth in the frost and fresh air in the heat wave. It would also be ungrateful to complain about the trade that linked caravans from North Africa to the Silk Road, which Phoenician seafarers turned into art, and which has been with our species since the day after Abel's burial. But the human is the sorcerer's apprentice. He always runs the risk that the enormous forces he awakens will turn against him. Not only because, as Virilio maintains, each invention brings with it its accident, so that when inventing navigation the possibility of shipwreck arose, when inventing the car the possibility of crash, and when inventing flying machines the possibility of air accident, but also because the fact that we are the only natural species that is not controlled by instinct, is rebellious against limits, and always wants more. To that Promethean appetite that makes us want to be faster, more powerful, richer, more skillful and safer, to that extreme competitiveness that is a powerful cause of hatred and wars, to that will to dominate that has made us the hegemonic species to which everything is subordinated, although we owe it many magnificent things that exist in our societies, the refinements of industry, the miracles of technology, the delights of modernity, we also owe it the recent eruption of great and disturbing planetary events that in less than 2 centuries have altered the natural balance, have produced increasing damage that destroys entire species and have endangered not only a civilization several thousand years old, but the very adventure of life on Earth. Someone declared that the true ancients are us and not the men of Genesis or Homer. An alien invented by Voltaire, Micr Omegas, complained that life on his planet lasted barely 30,000 years, a period, alas, comparable to an instant. This made us understand why we all die with the feeling that life was very short. The ability to learn that characterizes us, and that is the most terrible of our virtues, that thirst for novelty, that grace of invention, that curiosity on which the novelty of the information and communication media is based, that pugnacity that encourages armies, that competitiveness evidenced by sports and competitions, that aggressiveness that seems to be the law of history, that avidity for play, for love, for speed, for triumph, for risk, for delirium, perhaps they only indicate that ours it is a young species, and that Huxley was right when he stated that the human being is a puppy. Until 2 centuries ago we still moved to the rhythm of the elements, at the speed of the horse and the wind, and it can be said that each individual did not consume more energy than what he could deploy thanks to his food, or that which some conquests offered him. Ancient, such as animal taming, navigation and the wheel. Children of the sun and water, thanks to life we also obtain the benefit of fire, since only what was alive is fuel, but from early on our rhythm was that of Odysseus's candles, that of the footsteps of Dante and Virgil, that of the horseshoes of Bucephalо and Rocinante, which accompanied the discovery of the globe, of the terzarima and of narration. Humanity knew for a long time what Paul Valéry called, speaking of Goethe, the art of slow maturations. The world was not only wide and alien, to travel on foot was really to travel it, allowing living distances to mature us to see things. Perhaps the most beautiful thing about the stories of antiquity is the way in which everything had to be worth the effort. The Golden Fleece could not be reached in a few hours, the Odyssey would have been trivial returning in a charter to Ithaca. Of course, our anxiety yearned for the immediate encounter, but no one would find a mythological greatness in the perseverance of Odysseus if he had not had to overcome so many obstacles, and if the 20 years that had elapsed since his departure had not given that story all the beautiful and tragic dimension of absence. It would be interesting to know when the age of acceleration began. It is very likely that it was influenced by a change in diet, and especially the production of sugars, which initiated an alteration in our metabolism. The truth is that from a certain moment the human being began to expend more energy than he was capable of producing with his body, and this must have been seen by the culture as one of the triumphs of civilization, although it was the inadvertent beginning of our greatest dangers. It is already known that from the beginning there were those who were able to benefit not only from their own work but also from the strength of animals and the efforts of others. But to have, thanks to new sources of energy, a strength greater than that of our arms, the possibility of moving more with less fatigue, the possibility of having more light than that which the sun gave us, of lengthening the days, of obtaining products surplus, served more than anything else to make the human species the primary beneficiary of the world's gifts. First the talent to incite fire, then the art of dominating and directing the elements, and the power to exploit animal energy and to subdue the energy of fellow humans through war, had already given us a particular power and had outlined the model of our planetary domination, but it was the gaining of powerful new forces from fossil fuels, electricity, and machine design that suddenly triggered our power to transform the natural universe almost beyond recognition, that enhanced our transformative capacity until suddenly colliding with the unexpected, with the unexpected revelation that our virtue has its limits. Chapter 3. The Power of Myths. A century and a half ago, Nietzsche pronounced a sentence that was becoming more and more distressing: "You will perish for your virtues." Our virtues are innumerable, and if one of the jobs of philosophy was to discover and enumerate them, their celebration and encouragement became over time the main lure of publicity. But it is important to note that from the beginning there were in the human history of East and West, North and South, heroes and doctrines that were applied with ardor to contradict those virtues. Towards the 5th century before our era, the preaching of the Buddha in India and that of Diogenes of Sinope in classical Greece arose. Both configured a doctrine of renunciation. Buddha, raised in luxury and protected from the evils of the world, discovers one day that illness, old age, and death exist, and these three news make him become an ascetic, to seek the way to escape the will of the dead. Desires the liberation and the happiness of being deluded in the whole. Diogenes, induced by a response from the oracle to counterfeit currency, and reduced to prison for it, chooses to renounce all possessions and live in wisdom and poverty, barely collecting alms from his fellow citizens in exchange for the mortifying benefit of always telling them the truth. Truth. Those two wise men from East and West prepared the birth of Jesus, who would take the doctrine to its most paradoxical consequences. It would be said that Jesus was born to oppose all the spontaneous tendencies of the human being. Before those who exalt the virtue of work, he declares, "Look at the lilies of the field and the birds of the sky, that do not work or spin, and not even Solomon with all his pomp dressed like them." To those who appreciate hoarding and accumulation, he teaches, in his main prayer, to ask only for the daily bread. He recommends loving your enemies, giving the assailant what he forgot to take, turning the other cheek to those who hit you. He wants to see himself reflected only in the poorest, in the humblest, in the most unfortunate, seeks out the sick, prefers the marginalized, accepts the friendship of beggars and prostitutes, recommends humility, advises humiliation, announces that the last will be first, embraces lepers, frees the possessed, chooses among his disciples a venal traitor who will help him fulfill his mission, and at the last moment offers a thief a place at his side in paradise. It is not surprising that his doctrine has produced extreme developments in the world, such as those of the eloquent poet Almafuerte, who preaches failure as a virtue. "I venerated, genius of servility, in him who finally fell completely, the irredeemable cross of his mud, the unlightable night of its abyss. Who vindicates the destiny of the pariahs. I rejected the happy, the potentate, the honest, the harmonic and the strong, because I thought that luck fell for them, like any lucky gambler. And also attempts a rebellion against the rules. I spilled, with delicate arts on each reptile a caress. I did not think justice was necessary when pain reigns everywhere." Those who have studied Christ the most in our time agree that the one who understood him best was one of the anonymous soldiers who arrested him in the garden, and who commented to his companion, "No one has spoken like this man." However, I believe that Christ, Diogenes, and Buddha, in their most beautiful manifestations, will still be key figures of the future, because the world is more than ever in the hands of insensitive opulence, of a heartless and perverse idea of triumph, and of a legality infamous, that is capable of justifying that 1% of the planet's population owns half of the wealth, that punishes the poor who steal bread but blesses the banks that take away people's homes, that it is merciless with the minimal infractions of the dispossessed but authorizes the wars of dispossession and the voracity of the corporations, which hypocritically punishes the clumsy person who mistreats an animal but allows, in the shadows of the laboratories, the irreparable alteration of the genetic heritage of the species. The 20th century was the century of Hegel, of the well-intentioned idea that the task of the spirit was to take over the state and slowly transform it into human coexistence, destroying those sectors that tyrannized or diverted humanity from its goals. But a fellow student of Hegel, Friedrich Hölderlin, who had argued with him from time to time throughout his adolescence and understood the magnitude of the error, wrote in his beautiful novel Hyperion the definitive sentence on the subject: "Whenever man has wanted make the state his heaven, he has built his hell." Hölderlin understood why Christ had become the God of the West, the God who abolished the Greek pantheon and exalted himself in the mythical figure in whose shadow the age of reason would be born and strengthened, the triumph of the human over evil. Other species, the primacy of spirit over matter, and the dangerous enthronement of man as the image and likeness of divinity. Hölderlin did not see this as a mistake but as a poignant tragedy. Until the birth of Greek science, the world had been protected by a dense veil of sacredness. Nature was divine and could not be profaned by the experiments of curiosity or the thirst for knowledge. But once the status of geometry had been reached, once the tempting adventure of scientific knowledge had been encountered, which could perhaps reveal to us all the secrets, laws, and possibilities of nature, the insatiable human spirit was not in a position to give up that tempting apple. 5 centuries have passed since the moment when Plato questioned all the knowledge of his time in his dialogues, and when the adventure of Greek reason formulated its project, and a profound debate shocked the immense world over which Greece exerted its spiritual influence. That debate had become more intense after the adventure of Alexander, before whom, as the Bible says in the book of Maccabees, the earth was filled with silence. Auerbach has said that the silences of the Bible are not empty, but that they are silences where things happen, and that they are full of secret maturations. In that vast silence after Alexander's Aristotelian adventure in building a great empire of the entire known world, the Platonic doctrine of the double world passed from mind to mind, from word to mouth, and from century to century, from the rostrums of the scholars of Alexandria and the Platonic sects to the dark outskirts of the cities, from the Greek coasts to the Syrian coasts, and one day an angel appeared to a Hebrew maiden to announce that the infinite was going to interpolate in the temporal, the heavenly in the earthly and the divine in the human, and that a God would be born on earth. All the clays of the myth converged, not so much in Bethlehem, where the creature was born in the year 0 of our era, but in all the land of Judea, Syria, Turkey, Greece, and Rome, where the blurred memory of the preacher Jesus Christ, passionately venerated and hated by many Hebrews of his time and crucified by the Roman authorities at the behest of the people, was rebuilt over a couple of centuries after his execution, until he became the God of the new age of the world. For 20 centuries the skeptics exhausted the resources of reason to deny the divinity and even the historical existence of Christ, but the believers found in all these denials strength to argue their truth and their faith. Because myths are not refutable, and that of Christ is the strongest myth in all of Western history. Of that frail and moving God-man who preached in deserts and on the shores of lakes, who multiplied the loaves and fishes to feed his rapt audiences, who inadvertently cured a woman just because she touched his cloak, that he was tormented, murdered and buried, the fame spread that he had risen in the eyes of the soldiers who guarded his tomb, that he had appeared to his disciples and his friends in the following days, and that in the sight of all they had ascended to heaven body and soul, promising to return to establish the millennial kingdom. Even a man as detailed and lucid as Emmanuel Carrère, the contemporary incarnation of French agnosticism, who in his book The Kingdom has examined all the steps in the formation of myth in the writing of Mark and Matthew, all the episodes of the birth of doctrine in the letters and the Acts of the Apostles and in the terrible and fascinating figure of Saul of Tarsus, exalter of the small cult in imperial religion, and all the moments of the aesthetic and magical configuration of the legend in the novel by Luke and in the tremendous philosophical fictions of John the Evangelist or in the revelations of Patmos, he stops before Christ, at the gates of skepticism, almost convinced of divinity. And Fernando Vallejo himself, the most indignant critic of the crimes of the Church, incapable of believing in the divinity of Christ, has nonetheless spent his eyes questioning the first century of the Christian era, trying to see the moment when for the first time once the name of Christ appears in the manuscripts, making an effort to examine all the arguments, from the canonical Gospels to the Apocrypha, from the letters of Peter and Paul to the controversial and disturbing Flavian testimony. In order to judge that legend with all the rigor of history, but the fact is that when dealing with these issues, only the voice of poetry is useful, and it was precisely a French poet, Charles Baudelaire, who said that to reign over 20 centuries of Western civilization, to have filled the world with crusades, Gothic cathedrals and of symphonies, to have been the indubitable God of a long age of the world, Christ perhaps did not even need to exist. Chapter 4. The Christian Era. All myth is a collective creation, but the main characteristic of Christian myth, as Hölderlin correctly warned, is that for the first time in history, myth was not born only from revelation but from philosophy, and in its gestation in the dark bosom of the crowds converged at the same time the solar dreams of Akhenaten, the revelations of Moses and the Hebrew prophecies, the Platonic doctrine and its variations by the Mediterranean waters, and also the shadow of the three empires, the Pharaonic, the Alexandrine, and the Roman, who prepared his imperial future for him. Gibbon has said that the Christian Trinity actually condenses the triple national origin of that myth: Egyptian monotheism brought by Moses to Judea, Greek philosophy, and the vocation of universality of the Roman Empire, and has broken down that historical origin, affirming that in the most holy Trinity the Father is Hebrew, the Son is Greek, and the Holy Spirit is Roman. It would seem that a dark intuition of the species glimpsed the tremendous horizon that reason offered to the human adventure, that by mirror and in enigma felt that it was necessary to clear the way for the adventure of Greek science, whose status had been established by the geometry of Euclid, and that understanding in dreams that it was necessary to give license to the Spirit to undertake that immense task, gave rise to the Christian myth. But the dark genius of nature could not fail to notice the danger that this undertaking entailed, because something made Christ exclaim, "What good will it do a man to gain the world if he loses his soul?" Perhaps that is why Christ, and with him all the heralds of his advent, coined that paradoxical doctrine of renunciation, deprivation, austerity, peace, and the extreme vigilance of human pride, since it was he, as an expression, Hegel would say, of the universal spirit, who was secretly allowing humanity to advance along the path of Pythagoras and Thales of Miletus. In his sermons, Christ calls himself the Son of Man, and in this formula, repeated so many times, the singular secret of his divinity is formulated: Christ is not a God in the manner of the Greek divinities who preceded him and who without a doubt they engendered him. With Christ everything human is accessing the divinity. With Christ the divine, which before was dispersed in nature, in the watery turbulence of Poseidon, in the fertility of Ge, in the forests of Artemis, in the carnality of Aphrodite, in the anger of Ares, in the forge of thunder of Zeus, in the luminous harmony of Apollo, or in the orgiastic intoxication of Dionysus, that divinity before dispersed in the infinite forces of the world is folded and condensed in the Spirit. From Christ there was only divinity in the Spirit, of which the human mind was the terrestrial niche, and the immense desecration of nature that would alarm Julian, the emperor, in his time, was fulfilled. This could not immediately lead to an establishment of nature as an object of investigation and knowledge, although the ground had already been fertilized with the Aristotelian adventure of Alexander, but the foundational fact of the Christian myth had been fulfilled: the exaltation of man as measure of all things. The time would come when Augustine tried to exhaust all the spiritual and even intellectual possibilities of myth. The time would come when Thomas Aquinas, believing that he was convincingly arguing the arcana of faith and the rationality of dogmas, would free reason from its shackles and open the way to naturalism, the Renaissance, and the triumph of reason as supreme conquest of the Christian era. Many see in the Church's fury against Giordano Bruno's vision of infinite worlds, or in its repression against Galileo's thought, proof that Christianity could not have been the foundation of the triumph of reason. But history it does not proceed through unequivocal forces but through great vacillations and deviations and schisms, and if Christianity first resorted to dogma and violence to impose its doctrine of brotherhood and the triumph of the Spirit, its own crimes also forced it to stoop. In remorse, and if Augustine wanted to stop him in spiritualism, in contempt for matter, Thomas, as Chesterton has beautifully argued, while reconciling that religion with the world and with the joy of living, spent his vigils drawing from his head arguments more subtle and abundant than his own hair, to give a rational foundation to all that for which faith was previously sufficient. According to the Churches, the central fact of the mission of Christ was the redemption, the mystery of Golgotha, the death of Christ to redeem men from their sins. But Hölderlin, and through him the poetry of the West, boldly seeking to return to the role of ancient poetry as interpreter and modifier of myth, has sung that Christ's is not the myth of redemption but the myth of absence, that its most significant moment is not Golgotha but the ascension to heaven in body and soul, that what history reveals to us is that the mission of Christ was not carried out on the cross but in absence, that Christ is the God who left and that by leaving he left human beings alone with history. He sang that, however, in that absence there is no abandonment but a promise. It is as if he were telling us, once the human spirit envisioned the possibility of exploring everything, of knowing everything, of transforming everything, the Promethean complexion of our species was not in a position to give up that temptation, we had to accept the challenge of genius tempting and bite the apple. And Oscar Wilde has well said that the only way to escape temptation is to fall into it. Holderlin feels that the human being had to explore this path and that, in some way, Christ is the path he followed to desacralize the world and to divinize only the spirit. But he did not do so without leaving open, in a truly divine way, the possibility of reversing or at least stopping that process. He announced that his departure would not be definitive, that the divine would return to the world, although the poets have not yet sung what will be the way of that return. Because the return of Christ still does not have its poem, and it would be naive to think that it will consist of the descent of a being between luminous clouds to impart on our century the justice of 2,000 years ago. This would be equivalent to affirming that the entire Christian adventure was an empty pause, and the absences in the myth, to follow Auerbach once again, are silences in which things happen. One of the things that happened is that the human spirit truly developed the sciences, not only to penetrate the secrets of reality and to decipher the laws, but also to access the powers of divinity. The West first and the whole world later gradually advanced in the myth of the divinity of the spirit and in the desacralization of nature. Only thanks to that mysterious license the human being was able to apply himself to the gradual and growing task of investigating the world, of unraveling its laws, of mastering its secret keys, of using that knowledge step by step, transforming reality, assuming greater and greater powers. Until feeling in a position to intervene in the arcana of reality, penetrate the abysses of the atom and the cell, decipher the genetic code, reach the last gears of the physical world, decode the mathematical language of the universe, and arrive at the moment in which that it is already in a position to modify the text of nature, to change the letter of the world, to alter the laws of life and even to destroy the human body, acting on its intimate fabric with unpredictable mutations. Chapter 5. The Religion of Progress. While the adventure of knowledge lived its initial phase of freedom and amazing discoveries, humanity was able to feel the intoxication of its own talent, and in its boundless enthusiasm coined since the end of the European Middle Ages, and especially since the Renaissance, the legend of progress as the engine of history. Progress was the holy religion of scholars and merchants, of philosophers and poets, of scientists and rulers. The forces of progress took us from the Enlightenment to the Revolution, from the Age of Enlightenment to the Industrial Revolution, from the era of revolutions to the Belle Époque, from the cries of freedom, equality, and fraternity to the Kafkaesque power of large corporations. Modern society knew how to endow itself with all the eloquence of the old literary tradition, with all the visual refinement of great classical painting, with all the sublime perfection of music, from the first oratorios to the great masses of Bach, and from the dances peasant girls to Mahler's symphonies. How not to believe in progress if Michelangelo began where Praxiteles ended, if Leonardo began where Paolo Uccello ends, if London was the new Rome and Paris was the new Athens, if after the medieval silos and the garden of earthly delights Bosco came the great factories and the garden of delights of the Impressionists, if after the conquests of Courbet's realism and Delacroix's virtuosity, photography allowed us to reproduce reality down to the smallest detail, if after Montgolfier's balloons came the airplanes and, without leaving behind the old recursive and eloquent theater, the cinema filled the sky with giant faces and made us see the most inconceivable dreams come true. But the Belle Époque, the great moment of splendor of European culture, unexpectedly gave way to the First World War. If World War I killed faith in progress, World War II simply killed faith. The explosion of the atomic bombs, the epilogue of that hell, destroyed the hope of a few generations, and the European literature of the 50s, anchored in nihilism and in what they called existentialism, only knew how to see the absurdity of existence, the inconsistencies of history, the end of the magic of the world, the sleaze of the human adventure, the journey at the end of the night, the 25th hour, the fall, the nausea, and the tunnel. The next generation rose from the ashes and tried to believe in life again. German industry stopped making war tanks and went back to making cars and industrial machines. The fields of France went back to growing their grapes and making their Bordeaux and Burgundy. The museums reopened and the bells of the churches that had not been bombed rang again. The ropes seemed to have done the final job of punishing the monsters, the different nations hiding behind their steel and bamboo curtains. The present was a pair of nuclear arsenals of bizarre dimensions, capable of blowing up the world thousands of times, and history seemed to recover its human face and return to abnegation and dreams, but a very deep wound was hidden in the heart of the species, and only 3 new adventures tried to awaken in human beings the hope of a renewal of history. The first, fueled by science fiction, was travel to outer space. In 1969, the arrival on the moon seemed to inaugurate an era in which a humanity united by renewed collective dreams went out like Dante to look at the stars again. The second was the Great Defection, hippism, in which a new generation, fed up with and distrustful of the powers that had waged war, of the mental models that had triggered it, and of the lifestyle that had made it possible, wanted to abandon the industrial society, consumption, looking at the lilies of the field and the birds of the sky that neither work nor spin, and not even Solomon, with all his pomp, dressed like them, asking only for daily bread, practicing love free, to officiate at the altars of Buddha the renouncer, of Christ the lover, and of the millions of gods of poppies, hemp, ergot, and Amanita muscaria, go out, like Whitman, to embrace that pagan goddess, nature. The third, a little more serene and later, was ecology, which tried to moderate the excesses of industrial society, when it regained control of reality with new resources and unusual energy, which warned of the dangers of an industry that plundered the nature and that threatened the natural balance in a project that was not even sustainable in the long term. Although it did not change its philosophical horizon, and remained a prisoner of the idea of facilitating sustainable development within the guidelines of industrial society, environmentalism was the only one that managed to glimpse the leviathan that was nurtured in the shadow of the all-power of corporations, and the teratological nightmare that in a few decades would put the planet on the verge of an almost supernatural outcome. Although it was in the shadow of nuclear arsenals, big capital had to continue its project. But the truth is that the great political powers had reached an agreement. The future of the world was the industrial project, the expansion of the market, the technological revolution, the transport revolution, the great advertising symphony, the religion of brands, and the great cybernetic revolution that put computers in everyone's hands, that built the great planetary network, that accelerated the globalization of life, that took the gifts of cell phones to the point of converting each human organism into a permanent terminal for industry, of entertainment and information. It is true that the powers that be had to make an astonishing effort to invent, over the era of pessimism, an improvised religion of happiness through consumption, of satisfaction through incessant communication, of excitement through ultra-information, through the permanent diffusion from the web of planetary misfortunes, and a supply of increasingly seductive spectacles. It is not reality, it is not life, but it is its most admirable and refined simulation, its most exquisite ghost. And there is no doubt that humanity could remain forever absorbed in the magic of those screens, in the amazement of those special effects, in the stillness of those insignificant but exciting chats, in that immanence of paradise that is the technological society, that electrified threshold where everything we desire appears at the mere contact of the fingertip with the touch screen, where no one is far away, where absence, loneliness, isolation, or boredom apparently do not exist, and where we can go from theology to sex, from the atrocious to the mystical, from the most immaculate nature to the most sordid virtual reality with the push of a button. We could remain forever in that limbo of delights that do not satisfy us but that immediately lead us to new possibilities, in something that is not life but that is vertigo and dazzle, and that, like the cigarette, as Oscar Wilde said, it has the elegance of always leaving us unsatisfied. Now, it is becoming more and more evident that the forces applied to do all this, and the instances that are in a position to apply these changes, have long been subject to no other restriction than obtaining the resources to develop their research and carry out their mutations. To whom do they answer? Who authorizes your actions? Who is in a position to impose any limits on them? Who calibrates and assesses its consequences? Everything seems to indicate that, in the sphere of modern society, there can be no limits to knowledge, which is understandable, and there seem to be no limits to action, if one is under the protection of the appropriate powers. But the powers of the world have been becoming more and more autonomous. Planetary democracies, which are the last refuge until now of the collective will, increasingly act according to particular interests, and the most particular of those interests is that of great performance. It is no longer necessary to demonstrate that the political powers are subordinated to the great industrial powers, to the lobby of the corporations, that the media, which until yesterday only embodied the hope of being the voice of public opinion, are increasingly silent in the face of powers that are often their enormous and invisible owners, that the will of the species, which was once expressed in laws, which was once configured in states, which was once manifested in academic institutions, has been imperceptibly displaced by the inexorable advance of the great planetary powers applied to the only logic of growth, of accumulation, of the ostentatious appropriation of the world, of its concentric spheres of air, water, earth, magma, and fire, and already stretching its tentacles towards the crystalline skies. And above all, it is no longer necessary to exhaust oneself in arguments to demonstrate that all that accumulated and voracious power that monopolizes the earth and the air, the water and the subsoil, not only does it less and less for the benefit of humanity, but that it is efficiently destroying with our incessant complicity the old universe of the gods, poisoning the springs, degrading the waters, polluting the soil, surrounding the cities with garbage, covering the oceans with non-biodegradable waste, and producing an alteration of the planetary climate that at this time of history has already melted the Arctic, erased the glaciers from the poles and from the summits, modified the rhythm of the seasons, alters the maps of the vegetation and is about to explode, with the melting of the Siberian permafrost, the huge methane tanks that could trigger even more rapid and unpredictable warming. Those same powers that poison the atmosphere, and that destroy the ancient gastronomic treasure of cultures by throwing on our plate the improvised monstrosities of genetic experimentation, the nameless plate of caterpillars of the last days, not only foster mutation with climate change of microbes and the threat of pandemics but have replaced the old wisdom of preventive medicine that was based on food, hygiene, vigilance, and the timely and wise care of doctors who saw us as beings of integrity and as human beings, by a paraphernalia of machines and chemical and surgical solutions that leave us more and more helpless in the hands of increasingly arrogant professionals, themselves thrown from the old delicate and human medical wisdom to the outskirts of proletarianization and piecework, who necessarily have to shed their humanity if they want to survive in the region of machines and their sites. Gives Ice Chapter 6. Mother Earth. When, at the beginning of the 19th century, 3 romantic adolescents at the Tübingen Seminary drew up the oldest systematic program of German idealism, they proposed, with a wisdom and sensitivity that will become more and more visible, that humanity urgently needs new myths. These young people were the first generation of Kant's children, and they knew that, after laborious centuries of exploring the world and conquering reason, it would no longer be possible for humanity to return to the capricious myths of a more naive age, the gods, in which we now had to believe could not offend intelligence. That had been the fruit of 20 centuries of triumph of the spirit. Now we needed myths that do not repudiate reason, and reasonable ideas that do not conflict with the aesthetic sense of reality. They added that myths that make wise men sensitive and people reasonable were necessary, and those young people, Hegel, Schelling, and Hölderlin, applied themselves to the search for the remedy by different paths. Perhaps the most faithful example of that search is Hölderlin's poem To the Ether, which makes us feel the divine character of air without giving up showing it as an element, and which is at the same time thought, emotion, fantasy, song and prayer, as would later be the poem of the fourth element, in which Jorge Luis Borges runs on water, moving from mythology to history, from literature to everyday experience, from philosophical reflection to fantasy, and from song to moving prayer. Recently, the peoples of Latin America, on whom the duty of naming God in their political constitutions has always been imposed, have chosen to include in their constitutional texts the sacred nature of the nurturing land and the civilizing virtues of austerity and respect around the world, and it did not take long for rationalism to disqualify these proposals as superstitions. But it is becoming more and more evident that, if we want to survive, the sun and the wind will be the main suppliers of our energy, that from the sun, from which our life has already sprung, our dreams and our future inventions will spring like from a fountain, and that if Spinoza could suggest that the universe is one of the names of God, it would not be so foolish to see our divinities in the sun and in the earth. To that extent, one of the deepest religious texts is in those verses by Whitman, I believe that a blade of grass is not less than the path traveled by the stars, and that the ant is perfect, and so are the grain of sand and the thrush's egg, and that the frog is a masterpiece, worthy of the highest, and that the blackberry could adorn the halls of heaven, and that the slightest joint of my hand can humble all machines, and that the cow that grazes with its head lowered surpasses all statues, and that a mouse is a miracle enough to confuse millions of unbelievers. The natives of America did not understand that the Europeans made fun of them because they venerated the moon and the sun as gods, and nevertheless wanted to force them to pray on their knees before a pair of crossed logs, arguing that this was the gallows where a very good man had been sacrificed. In that single image is summed up the entire modern debate on civilization and barbarism. As Montaigne said, we tend to call what others think barbaric, even if it is much more sensible. Some have said that one cannot speak of the earth as a mother, because the earth not only nurtures and protects but can also be a destructive power full of catastrophes. But mythologies have always been able to see that complexity of symbols that naive rationalists find so hard to see. In one of his beautiful poems to the Virgin Mary, Chesterton sees the moon pass through the sky and does not fail to perceive its deep fantastic projections, the dark Diana of the caves he says whose name in hell is Hecate. But it is the reading of Sigmund Freud that will best help us understand why we can see the earth as a mother. It is not that nature is not destructive. In it are equally Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the protector, and Shiva, the great destroyer. Loving her means not only being intimate with her but also respecting her, fearing her, endlessly questioning her. But what the instructive experience of our hegemony has shown us is that the levels of destruction of nature can be much higher if we alter its balance without prudence and without scruples. There will always be a Mount Tambora ready to erupt, with its terrible and fascinating supply of tsunamis, bloody twilights, symphonies, and monsters, and there will always be natural processes beyond our control, but if we are interested in the human adventure it is better that civilization does not consist of in mistreating the tail of a sleeping dragon. It may not be in our hands to prevent the cycles of the universe from ending the world in 10 million years, but we can prevent our ingenuity from destroying it in 3 centuries. Perhaps a long adventure of knowledge will teach us things as amazing as those promised by Cartesian meditation and Husserl's philosophy, reveal truths as moving as those glimpsed by Dante in the last canto of the Divine Comedy, or give us powers as incredible as those that Novalis saw in the notes of his encyclopedia, but what we are doing today is using the magic wand not to calm the oceans but to awaken the monsters. Finish. Stop dry. William Ospina.